women, any more of you pregnant? All right. So, so, so when you four women give birth to your children, they would have a ceremony for you and consecrate your baby. And Lance, in my thinking, that's man-made. That is bringing in some man-made idea, as if that invokes a special blessing that God wouldn't give that baby in the first place. Anyway, very, very good point.
Because she thought, because one was on one side and one was on the other, it was all wrong. And the only reason we did it was so the guy that was saying the prayer would be, it line up for him, he wouldn't be having to. Sometimes you get that and your head gets stuck up there. And she was upset because we switched what side bread was on versus.
Now, the Bible says the fruit of the vines is supposed to be on the right side. Yesterday at this wedding, the bride chose to reverse. The bride and her party were on my left, and the groom and his party were on my right. They reversed everything like that. I said, okay. I said, it's your wedding.
About some of this stuff. It's how we handle it, because some of it is just unlearned. I know here one time when we had what we got the communion deal we got now, way back yonder, whoever had the prayer for the bread had to break it.
Break it first.
Break it first. Yeah.
Right.
And really that's just an unlearned kind of.
Right.
They had to break it first and then offer the prayer. You've seen the communion trays with a little cross on top of it. You hold the cross and pick the lid up. At Gun Barrel Congregation, a lot of them really oppose that as being more Catholic. And I'm telling you, people will just challenge anything. We had a brass cross up there. It wasn't a cross, but it was like this. They objected, so they disassembled the brass and put it in a different design. Okay, publican. Now, again, the Greek word is tax collector, not publican. A publican is different from a tax collector. Publicans were those who bought up provinces. You remember me teaching you this several months ago? A publican was a tax farmer. He bought property for 5 years at a time. So let's say that Dale says, I think I'm going to buy up the rights to the tax money on Van Zandt County. And they would pay from $5,000 to $9,000 U.S. money back in the days of the Roman Empire. All right, this is before A.D., back in the BCs. For 5 years, that gave them the right to all the tax revenue. And so they then hired lower scale people, more like the slum of society, to collect the taxes because they had to be somewhat uncouth. And we're talking about Zacchaeus, all right? And Levi. These were uncouth men. They were scoundrels, but they were the exact thing that these tax farmers were looking for. They had to be the kind of people who could say, all right, Wayne, you've got a cattle trailer, or you've got let's go, airplane. I'm assessing you 14% tax on that, when the law would allow you charge you only 3%. The rest was their profit. Now that takes an unscrupulous man who can do that. They can charge up to 16%. After that, the state said it's stealing. But you can steal from 3 to 12% or 3 to 14%. So this is what we're dealing with. That is why the publicans were not allowed in the synagogue. They would not allow them in the synagogue. That is why Jesus and his disciples and John's disciples were all up in a roar when Jesus was eating with publicans. That's right. The exact time. The exact time. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. All right. So again, a publican was really a tax farmer, not a tax collector. As the Greek word translated publican or telones means, they in turn hired these tax collectors, usually lower class men or slaves. They could assess an ad valorem tax of 2.5% to 12.5%, depending upon the merchandise. So the tax, if you have a cart, you were taking a two-wheel cart, you were driving down the road, they would unload everything and tax every item. Every item. They were at seaports. Anytime you crossed the Sea of Galilee, there were tax collectors. Anytime you went down the Via Maris, there were tax collectors. They were everywhere. And they were hated with a vengeance. It was considered cheating to charge over 16%. Tax gatherers were grouped with Gentiles and sinners, murderers and prostitutes. And Zacchaeus was a chief. This tax farmer hires 25 tax collectors. He's got to choose a chief over them. And Zacchaeus was that chief. Verse 11, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men, extortioner. Now notice, this is the Pharisee. I am not an extortioner, unjust, an adulterer, or even as this publican. The chances are he was lying out his teeth. All right, the word stood. In the Greek text, he struck a pose, assumed an attitude where he could be seen. He wasn't just standing like I'm standing. He took some kind of a unusual pose that people would take notice. Standing was the common Jewish posture in prayer. He took a stand, as the Greek says, right up front, next to the balustrade which divided the court of the priests from the court of the Israelites. This was where the Pharisee was, not the publican. Okay, the Pharisee could continue going through the court of the Gentiles, into the court of the women, and beyond that, into the court of the Israelites. And remember, if that's the court, this is the court of the Israelites. That's the court of the priests. There was a balustrade or a barrier, a fence, however you want to say it, and he went up to this fence. He got as close to God as he could, and then he offered this prayer. All right, prayed thus with himself. He wasn't addressing God. He was merely giving himself a testimonial before God. Rather than this being a prayer to God, the Pharisee was patting himself on the back, telling himself how great a guy he really was. Extortioners in the original, the Greek, means a robber, a plunderer, a grafter, like tax collectors. He assessed himself negatively, telling about things he was not guilty of. Now he begins telling the Lord about his good deeds. He uses the pronoun I 5 times in this short prayer. He was telling God what a great fellow he was. And it's much like that the guy that built his barns, you know, and he was going to have to tear them down and build more barns for his greater goods. I. All right, now let's go to verse 12. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Have you ever really thought about the Jews paying tithes. They had 4 tithes. They didn't just have 1 tithe, they had 4. They had to pay 10% of the leaves on their fruit trees. They had to pay 10% of the animals they had, 10% of the money they had, 10% of everything they owned. Then they had the tithe of the poor. Then they had the tithe of the Levite. As I said, 4 different tithes. They paid 10% at each one of them. And then they paid taxes to the Roman government. It's unbelievable how much money was extracted from every Jewish person. The law prescribed only one mandated fast, mandated only one fast a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement. Now, what is the modern term for the Day of Atonement? What do the Jews call it today? Hanukkah. That's right, Hanukkah. That's the Day of Atonement. However, Jews established 4 other fast days. Now, this was this was man's doing here, okay? God mandated that one. Now man comes in and he mandates 4 more, believing they could obtain special merit with God by doing more. Private fasts, is it wrong to fast today? No. Is it wrong to circumcise? No. You know, after the church was established, you know, Peter and John kept going to the temple. They kept going to the synagogue. They kept participating in the feasts. All right? It's okay to do these things, but if you do them, if you legislate them as that which has to be done in order to curry favor with God, you're wrong. You can have whatever view you want, but be careful when you try to legislate it onto me.
The man was there, and as long as these people had been under the system, and it took a long time to do away with it, and for Christianity to come in. It wasn't just overnight kind of deal. This was hundreds of years, probably.
Very much so.
For to get what God had intended for it to be. You got to do away. It's just like one man baptized. I got to put off this old self and back on the new. Well, it took a long time for all of that to take place. So these people that were raised up generation after generation after generation without this. They're really, do away with it.
Well, I know Carl in the same situation. Throughout my years in the ministry, people would come out of the Church of God and other churches, Catholics. I've baptized more Catholics than any other group. All right. And they still have some little practices or some little beliefs that they were trained, with all their life in the Church of God. Like one guy thought he still lived above sin. He was baptized into Christ, but he still believed, because that's what the Church of God teaches, you can live above sin. So we had to retrain him, reteach him, get his thinking straight. And that's an excellent point. Now, remember, John the Baptist came for what purpose? The overall main reason. To prepare the way for Christ. Christ then comes and he prepares the way for the church. There were 2 preparations. John was not enough for God to go from John to the church. He had to have this fill-in. And that fill-in was, adequately taken care of by Christ. And that, Dale, that's why he had to have 2 of the greatest men to ever put foot on the earth, his son and John, in order to try to change the thinking of these people. Well, look, it's specifically pointed out in the church of Antioch, the teachers. The teachers.
Well, I think too, when you look at John's work, you look at Jesus' work, then when you look at the work of the apostles, even in that, God was coming what I've heard people describe as taking half steps.
Well, even the apostles were preparatory.
Yes.
They were laying
Think
preparation.
about Acts 1:8.
Yeah.
They're going to Jerusalem, started in Jerusalem, then they went to the Jews. That was a bigger step, a half step. Went to the Samaritans. That was a half step. Go to the rest of the world. That's another half step.
Because if the Jerusalem, then the broader circle of Jews, and then the Samaritans, who were, you can see kind of between Gentiles and Jews, and then the Gentiles. So it was incremental steps. And that's how a baby learns to walk. Incremental steps.
And I think with it, one of the most interesting things is they met those people where they were every step of the way with the gospel.
Yeah, where they were, what they knew, their thinking. Yeah.
And took them where they needed to be, however long that took. I mean, even today, when we meet people, man, we would like for them to know everything, just walk up and say, I'm Carl McCann, American Church of Christ, I want to be baptized, and they say yes.
And they had no idea.
That's what we wish they would, that's what we wish they were, but the reality is, a lot of folks, whether they're raised in a denomination, whether they're unchurched at all, they're carrying a lot of baggage. And we've got to be willing to help them unload that baggage.
In fact, Carl and Dale, what you said a while ago, remember studying the importunate widow and the unjust steward? The lesson that God wanted us to learn, Jesus wanted us to learn from that was wisdom. We've got to be wise in how we handle people. And you can go up to a person and say something and drive them away from the church for the rest of their lives. But you can take that same person and you can take these incremental steps, and before you know it, they're baptized believers.
They said, I can't teach you like I'd like to because you're carnal.
You're yet carnal. Mm-hmm. You're yet carnal. Yes, Stan.
Well, people as a whole, you hate change.
Oh, I despise change.
We despise change, we hate change, we fight it through the thumbnail. And when you try to change the way people think, and I'm not with it, because I try to go make it be without doing the half-A's and half-B's. Yeah, this is good, we do this because of this. But
Sue, did I hear you? Amen.
it just, nobody likes change, and whether it's in the secular world, or whether it's in the spiritual realm, whatever it's in, if we have to make a change from what we've been raised up as, mom and dad did it that way, grandma did it that way, I was trained to do it that way, so it's gotta be okay, because the house didn't burn down back then, so it's not gonna burn down tomorrow, we're gonna do it.
In 88, when I started preaching at Gun Barrel, the elder said, we're going to buy you a cell phone. I said, I don't want a blasted cell phone. I don't want one. And I went for a while. I didn't want a cell phone. Then now I can't do without it. They said, we're going to put a computer in your office. I said, I don't want a computer. Don't give me a computer. Stan, that's how much I object to change. All right. Now we can't do without it. All right. Those who fasted whitened their faces. I'm in the second paragraph. Whitened their faces, appearing in shabby clothing, and put on a show of great piety. According to these two passages, the Levites were to receive a tithe of all a man's produce. But this, he tithed all he had, even though he was under no obligation. He says, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the Greek word is not possess, but acquire. Acquire. All right, verse 13. And the publican standing afar off would not lift. That means he was outside in the court of the Gentiles. So here is the Pharisee in the court of the Israelites. Here's the court of the women, and he's outside of that. He did not think he deserved to get any closer. Of course, by law, he couldn't. All right. The Greek word means he stood far from the object to the person, meaning he stood far off from the sanctuary as he could. The sanctuary was the holy house, the holy place, and the holy of holies. That was all called the sanctuary. All right, at the rear of the court, Israelites, at the beginning of the court of the, there are different ways you can explain that. He felt that he was not too unworthy to come any closer. He didn't feel like he was worthy of it. In fact, he felt too unworthy to even lift up his eyes in the face of the sanctuary. He couldn't even look in that direction. Smote upon his breast. This is an Oriental custom. This was the way of showing great sorrow. This act symbolized the publican's contrition. To this we add his confession of sin in the next clause. Be merciful to me, a sinner. Literally, the Greek says be merciful to me, the open and notorious sinner. The humility of this tax collector, and again, the proper translation is tax collector, not publican, is seen in that number one, he stood afar off. He prayed without first making sure everyone saw him. He would not even look up toward heaven. He referred to himself not as a sinner, but the sinner. The King James says a sinner, but the Greek says the sinner. Like Paul in 1 Timothy 1:15, this tax collector considered himself to be the sinner par excellence. What did Paul call himself in 1 Timothy 1:15? The chief of sinners. You know, the rest of his life, Paul never forgot what he did. He never forgot it. We hear the phrase forgive and forget. It is impossible for the human mind to forget so many things. Right.
But it sticks, a lot of them, it sticks with us. Sometimes a lot of things we have in our life.
I hear our little angels. Thank you.